They weren't glamorous. They weren't made for box office glory. These were the war films that veterans, men who actually lived the chaos, said, got it right. The grit, the fear, the brotherhood, the silence before a shell lands. Forgotten by modern audiences, these films dared to tell the truth when Hollywood preferred heroics. But some were too real and quietly disappeared. Number 15, The Hill, 1965. When The Hill premiered, audiences didn't know what to make of it. Starring Sean Connery at the height of his Bond fame, it stripped away every trace of glamour. This was no tale of medals or victory. It was about cruelty within your own ranks. Set in a brutal British military prison in the North African desert, The Hill follows soldiers punished by their own army. They're forced to climb a man-made hill over and over under the scorching sun, breaking their bodies for discipline. Connery's character, Sergeant Roberts, refuses to obey inhuman orders and pays dearly. Veterans later said it was the only film that captured how authority could crush men just as war did. The realism was suffocating. The film was banned on several bases for undermining morale. The British Army publicly condemned it, calling it anti-military. Behind the scenes, tensions mirrored the story. Director Sidney Lumet pushed his actors to exhaustion in real desert heat. Connery clashed with producers who feared tarnishing his Bond image. But the actor insisted. It was the most honest role he'd ever played. Critics in 1965 were divided, yet soldiers wrote letters praising its authenticity. The film faded from theaters, too bleak for mainstream audiences, but later resurfaced as a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It wasn't about fighting the enemy. It was about surviving your own side. Number 14, Cross of Iron, 1977. Sam Peckinpah's Cross of Iron was chaos incarnate, just like the war it depicted. Released in 1977, it told the story of German soldiers on the Eastern Front. No glory, no victory, just exhaustion, blood, and disillusionment. James Coburn stars as Sergeant Steiner, a weary officer who despises the aristocratic captain sent to command him. When orders turn suicidal, Steiner's rebellion becomes a metaphor for every soldier's disgust with politics and class hierarchy. Veterans who'd seen combat in Europe were stunned. They said it was the only war film that smelled like mud and fear. The camera work was dizzying, the explosions real, and the moral rot unmistakable. Yet, it offended nearly everyone. In West Germany, critics accused it of humanizing Nazis. In America, studios panicked at its bleak tone. Peckinpah, already infamous for his violent films, fell into heavy drinking during the shoot. His constant battles with producers nearly destroyed the film. When it premiered, Cross of Iron flopped in the US. But soldiers recognized its raw truth. In Eastern Europe and Russia, it became a cult classic, an anti-war legend screened privately in military clubs. Its legacy endured quietly. Quentin Tarantino once called it criminally underrated. Veterans called it too real for comfort. Peckinpah's career never recovered, but Cross of Iron remains the only film that dared to show World War II from the losing side's mud-caked trenches, with brutal, unfiltered humanity. Number 13, The Steel Helmet, 1951. Before the Korean War was even over, the steel helmet arrived, and Washington wasn't happy. Directed by Samuel Fuller, a World War II veteran himself, it was shot in just 10 days on a shoestring budget. Yet, it became one of the first truly authentic portrayals of war's moral decay. The film follows Sergeant Zach, Gene Evans, a battle-hardened survivor trying to lead a ragtag squad through Korea. The soldiers are cynical, exhausted, and unsure who the enemy really is. Fuller, who had fought at Normandy, infused every scene with what he called the stink of war. But it was the dialogue that caused outrage. When a black soldier questions why he's fighting for a country that still treats him as second class, Congress took notice. The U.S. Army condemned the film for disloyalty. Fuller was investigated by the FBI. Behind the camera, Fuller shot with real veterans using leftover war equipment. The helmets, mud, and rations were all authentic. He even risked censorship by showing American soldiers committing questionable acts, something unheard of in 1951. Audiences were divided. Some called it treasonous. Others, especially veterans, called it the first movie that told the truth. The film disappeared from theaters quickly, but lived on in film schools and underground screenings. Today, The Steel Helmet is hailed as the first great American anti-war film. Fuller once said, "If you've seen war, you'll never again believe in clean hands." Veterans nodded. They'd already known. Number 12. The Big Red One, 1980. By the time The Big Red One hit theaters in 1980, it was already a ghost of what its director intended. Samuel Fuller, yes, the same veteran who made The Steel Helmet, spent decades trying to tell his own story of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, through a lens of weary humanity rather than Hollywood valor. Lee Marvin, himself a veteran of the Pacific War, played the battle-scarred sergeant leading his men from North Africa to Normandy. The film chronicled the war not as a crusade, but as a long, bloody endurance test. Its tone was matter-of-fact. War wasn't glory, it was repetition, fear, and survival. But studio interference gutted it. Warner Brothers slashed Fuller's 3-hour cut down to a brisk 2, ripping away much of its emotional depth. Veterans who attended early screenings said it was too quiet, too real. Critics didn't. Understand it. It bombed commercially. Behind the scenes, the production mirrored Fuller's own frustration with war, budget cuts, disagreements, and his refusal to glamorize killing. Lee Marvin, suffering from alcoholism and PTSD, reportedly broke down during a scene depicting liberated concentration camps. Decades later, a restored director's cut resurfaced, finally revealing Fuller's intended version. Veterans hailed it as one of the most authentic depictions of camaraderie and endurance. Unlike propaganda-laden war epics, The Big Red One showed the exhaustion between battles, the boredom, the small jokes, the endless march. It's not about who wins, it's about who makes it home. Fuller, who saw war firsthand, said it best. Surviving doesn't make you lucky, it makes you haunted. Number 11. Tunes of Glory, 1960. At first glance, Tunes of Glory looks like a quiet post-war drama, but beneath its stately Scottish bagpipes lies one of the most devastating depictions of military pride and emotional collapse ever filmed. Released in 1960, the film stars Alec Guinness and John Mills as 2 officers locked in psychological warfare within a Highland regiment after World War II. One is a war hero, the other a by-the-book disciplinarian. Their clash becomes a slow-motion tragedy. Veterans recognize the truth instantly, the trauma that doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It's about men who can't let go of command, who only feel alive within the structure of war. The drinking, the loneliness, the haunting sense of pointlessness. It was too real for comfort. There was no censorship, but the British Army quietly discouraged screenings on bases, calling it damaging to morale. Many officers despised how it portrayed command as fragile and self-destructive. Behind the scenes, Alec Guinness was at his peak, but the intensity of his role drove him to insomnia. John Mills later said, "We were acting out ghosts, our fathers and our own." Though praised by critics, Tunes of Glory vanished into art house obscurity. Only veterans and film historians kept it alive. Today it's recognized as one of the finest anti-war films ever made, without showing a single battlefield. Because sometimes, the hardest war is the one you fight after the war ends. Number 10. A Walk in the Sun, 1945. While America was still at war, one film dared to show it without the gloss, A Walk in the Sun. Released in 1945, it followed a platoon of U.S. soldiers slogging through Italy. Not in triumph, but confusion. The men bicker, joke, panic, and pray as they march toward an objective none of them fully understand. There are no sweeping speeches or orchestral glory, just heat, dust, and exhaustion. The war feels endless, mechanical, absurd. For audiences fed on patriotic propaganda, it was shocking. Some theaters pulled it from circulation after veterans called it too real. Military censors disliked its lack of heroism, labeling it defeatist. But to actual soldiers, it was gold. The film's writer, Philip Stevenson, was blacklisted soon after. His work was deemed un-American during the Red Scare. Director Louis Milestone, himself an immigrant and veteran, fought to preserve the realism, even using real combat footage as visual reference. Behind the camera, actors rehearsed in real mud pits and endured scorching conditions to mimic battle fatigue. One studio executive allegedly called it too depressing to sell popcorn, Decades later, war historians rediscovered it. Veterans still say, A Walk in the Sun captures the real rhythm of war better than any blockbuster. It's about marching towards something you don't believe in, but marching anyway. Because sometimes survival isn't about courage. It's about continuing to walk when you don't know why. Number 9. Hell in the Pacific, 1968. When Hell in the Pacific premiered in 1968, it broke every rule of war cinema. There were no armies, no flags, and barely any dialogue. Just two men stranded on an island, forced to confront the futility of everything they'd been taught to hate. Lee Marvin, an American veteran, plays a downed U.S. pilot. Opposite him stands Toshiro Mifune, a Japanese naval officer. Both men are trapped on a desolate Pacific island during World War II, locked in an endless cycle of hostility, survival, and reluctant cooperation. Veterans immediately understood what the film was saying. The real enemy wasn't each other. It was the machinery of war itself. Yet many critics at the time didn't. American audiences found it strange and unpatriotic. Japanese reviewers said it was too raw. The studio panicked over its bleak tone. They even shot two different endings, one hopeful, one tragic. The U.S. release chose the bleaker version, both men destroyed just as they begin to understand each other. In Japan, a more ambiguous finale was used. Behind the scenes, Marvin and Mifune, both real veterans, struggled to communicate, using translators and mutual respect instead. Their on-screen tension wasn't acting. It was genuine, born from history itself. Though a box office disappointment, Hell in the Pacific became a quiet legend among servicemen. Many called it the only film that truly captured the loneliness of war, the absurdity of two men trapped in their government's hatred. It asks the hardest question of all. If two soldiers could find peace, why couldn't their nations? Number 8. The Cruel Sea, 1953. For sailors who fought in World War II, The Cruel Sea was more than a movie. It was memory. Released in 1953, it was based on Nicholas Montserrat's novel and depicted life aboard a British corvette hunting submarines in the North Atlantic. There are no glamorous victories here, just relentless cold, fear, and fatigue. Jack Hawkins stars as Captain Erickson, a man tormented by decisions that cost lives. In one harrowing scene, he orders depth charges dropped on enemy subs, knowing his own men are in the water. Veterans called it too close to home. Many couldn't finish the film. Naval officers confirmed that the story mirrored countless real incidents kept classified for decades. Some screening events for ex-servicemen ended in silence rather than applause. The Admiralty praised its accuracy, but disliked its emotional honesty. For years, it was quietly sidelined in official circles, too grim for recruitment propaganda. Behind the scenes, filming was brutal. Real Royal Navy ships were used, and the cast endured freezing conditions. Hawkins suffered frostbite during shooting, but insisted on completing the scene. Director Charles Friend refused to add melodrama, saying, "The sea itself is the villain." Critics hailed it as the truest sea film ever made. But the public, still recovering from post-war trauma, stayed away. It faded into quiet respect, later revived by naval veterans who screened it at remembrance gatherings. The ocean doesn't take sides. It only consumes. That's what The Cruel Sea dared to show. Number 7. The Bridge at Remagen, 1969. By the late 1960s, war movies had grown bombastic again. But The Bridge at Remagen did something different. It stripped away heroism and showed World War II's final days through chaos, exhaustion, and confusion. Set in March 1945, it follows American forces racing to capture Germany's last intact bridge across the Rhine before it's destroyed. George Segal and Robert Vaughn lead opposing sides, both men just trying to survive as the world collapses around them. Veterans praised its realism. There were no clean uniforms, no speeches, no morale. Soldiers moved like ghosts through bombed-out towns, unsure what they were dying for now that victory was certain. One veteran wrote to the studio, "This is how it really felt, pointless but necessary." But the film's production was cursed. Shot in Czechoslovakia, it was interrupted by the Soviet invasion of 1968. The cast and crew barely escaped before the borders closed. Some sets were seized by local troops. Extras disappeared into political detention. The chaos mirrored the story itself, a bridge between hope and ruin. When released, it was banned across several Eastern Bloc nations for Western propaganda, though ironically, many soldiers in those countries traded black market copies. It didn't glamorize war. It showed the futility of men fighting for ground that didn't matter anymore. When the real Remagen veterans watched it, many wept. They said it captured what most films refused to, that by the war's end, nobody felt like a hero, just survivors counting the hours until silence returned. Number 6. Attack, 1956. Few films have the nerve to accuse their own military of that moral cowardice, but Attack did exactly that. Released in 1956, directed by Robert Aldrich, this intense drama ripped apart the myth of leadership under fire. Jack Palance stars as Lieutenant Costa, a brave yet furious officer who watches his incompetent captain, Eddie Albert, repeatedly send men to their deaths because of fear. When command politics cost lives, Costa swears revenge, not against the enemy, but against the man wearing his own uniform. Audiences were stunned. This wasn't about heroics. It was about betrayal within the ranks. Veterans immediately recognized the truth. Not all officers were heroes, and not every soldier trusted the chain of command. The U.S. Army despised it, calling it insubordinate fiction. Military bases banned screenings, and Aldrich was labeled anti-American. Behind the scenes, tension ran deep. Palance, a real veteran of the Air Force, reportedly channeled his wartime trauma into his explosive performance. Eddie Albert, ironically also a decorated veteran, struggled to play a coward, telling reporters, "I hated myself every day on that set." Critics praised its unflinching intensity, but distributors grew nervous. It was pulled from wide circulation and faded into cult status among servicemen. European audiences, however, embraced it, recognizing its honesty about power, fear, and moral decay. In later years, veterans praised Attack for showing something other films never dared: the idea that sometimes the most dangerous man in battle isn't the enemy with a rifle, but the coward with authority. It's not just a war film, it's a moral reckoning with leadership itself. Number 5. The Thin Red Line, 1998. Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line wasn't a typical war movie. It was a meditation on existence wrapped in the chaos of Guadalcanal. Released in 1998, it divided audiences but earned deep reverence from veterans who called it the closest thing to what war feels like in the mind. Unlike other war epics, it had no central hero. Instead, it wove the thoughts of multiple soldiers, fear, awe, confusion, into one haunting narrative. Starring Sean Penn, Jim Caviezel, and Nick Nolte, it portrayed soldiers not as warriors, but as fragile souls adrift in a world turned savage. The cinematography was dreamlike, almost spiritual, but that beauty carried a paradox, the horror beneath the jungle's calm. Veterans said it mirrored the dissociation of combat, how nature stays serene while men lose their sanity. Hollywood didn't know how to market it. It opened just months after Saving Private Ryan, which glorified chaos with blood-soaked realism. Malick's quiet, philosophical approach baffled mainstream audiences, yet struck a nerve with real soldiers. Many wrote letters calling it the most honest depiction of our thoughts in battle. Behind the scenes, the production was chaotic. Malick shot over 1 million feet of film, cutting entire performances, including Adrian Brody's, to mere seconds. Studio executives panicked over its pacing and voiceovers, but Malick refused to compromise. Though divisive upon release, The Thin Red Line grew into a masterpiece of introspection. It doesn't ask what war is, but why it exists, and whether the human soul can ever return unchanged. War may end on paper, but in the mind, it echoes forever. Number 4. The Train, 1964. When John Frankenheimer's The Train premiered in 1964, critics called it a thinking man's action movie. Veterans, however, saw something deeper. A story about sacrifice, duty, and the strange obsession men have with what war destroys, and what it preserves. Set during the final days of Nazi occupation, Burt Lancaster stars as a French resistance fighter trying to stop a German colonel, Paul Schofield, from stealing France's priceless art treasures by train. The premise sounds simple, but it's war stripped to its essence, a battle for meaning. Frankenheimer shot real trains colliding, with Lancaster performing his own dangerous stunts. There were no miniatures, no trickery, just raw physical destruction that symbolized the moral wreckage of Europe itself. Behind the scenes, the film was nearly canceled after director Arthur Penn was fired mid-production. Lancaster, himself a World War II veteran, insisted on continuing under Frankenheimer, who rewrote the script to focus less on art and more on human endurance. The result was breathtakingly tense and morally complex. Veterans applauded its depiction of duty without glory. One reviewer wrote, "It's the only war film that makes you question what's worth dying for." Some countries, however, disliked its message. In France, censors demanded changes to avoid portraying the resistance as fractured. In Germany, distributors delayed release, fearing it might reopen old wounds. Over time, the train faded into history, overshadowed by flashier war movies. But among veterans, it became legend, proof that bravery isn't about killing or winning. It's about holding on to civilization's soul, even as the world burns around you. The art on that train wasn't just culture, it was everything humanity stands to lose when war takes over. Number 3. The Bridges at Toko-ri, 1954. When The Bridges at Toko-ri opened in 1954, many expected another patriotic Korean war drama. What they got instead was a heartbreakingly honest meditation on sacrifice and futility. Based on James Michener's novel, the film starred William Holden as Lieutenant Harry Brubaker, a World War II veteran reluctantly recalled to duty for a war he doesn't understand. He's not portrayed as a fearless hero. He's weary, bitter, and simply wants to return home to his wife and children. The mission, bombing heavily defended bridges in North Korea, feels less like duty and more like fate. When he's shot, down and stranded in enemy territory, his death isn't glorious. It's quiet, meaningless. Veterans wept. They said it captured what few films dared, the dread of being ordered back into a fight you no longer believe in. The U.S. Navy initially supported the production, then distanced itself when test audiences called the ending too hopeless. Studio executives begged director Mark Robson to reshoot a heroic finale. Robson refused. Behind the scenes, real Navy pilots flew the aerial sequences, risking their lives for authenticity. The footage was so real, it was later used for military training films. But critics accused the movie of defeatism. Some theaters even refused to show it during patriotic holidays. Over time, The Bridges at Toko-ri became a secret favorite among veterans who saw themselves in Holden's exhaustion. One naval officer famously said, "It's the only film that shows what it feels like to fight for something you can't explain." The movie ends with a haunting question that echoes through every war. Where do we get such men? The veterans who knew the answer were the ones who never came home. Number 2. King and Country, 1964. Few war films have dared to confront their own army as boldly as King and Country. Directed by Joseph Losey, this bleak masterpiece takes place in the sodden trenches of the First World War, where the real battle isn't against the Germans, but against the system that eats its own men alive. Tom Courtenay plays Private Hamp, a simple, shell-shocked soldier who walks away from the front for 48 hours, his first act of defiance after years in the mud. Dirk Bogarde is Captain Hargreaves, the officer assigned to defend him at a court-martial for desertion. What begins as duty slowly becomes horror, as Hargreaves realizes the justice he's sworn to serve is nothing more than ritualized cruelty. Veterans saw themselves in Hamp's trembling confusion. They said it was the first film to show what happened when bravery ran dry and command refused to understand. Filmed in claustrophobic black and white inside dripping sets, every frame feels like decay made visible mud, rot, futility. The British Army despised it. The BBC refused to air it for years, calling it demoralizing. Behind the camera, Losey, a blacklisted American exile, used handheld shots and real WWI diaries to capture the madness of bureaucracy in uniform. The film ends with Hamp's execution in a downpour, the camera fixed not on the firing squad, but on the faces forced to watch. For veterans, King and Country remains a devastating reminder that sometimes courage dies not in battle, but in silence, under orders. Number 1. Paths of Glory, 1957. No list of truthful war films is complete without Paths of Glory. Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, released in 1957, shattered illusions about valor, command, and justice. Kirk Douglas stars as Colonel Dax, a French officer ordered to lead his men in a suicidal assault during World War I. When they inevitably fail, 3 soldiers are chosen at random to be executed for cowardice. It's not about bravery, it's about politics, pride, and cruelty disguised as discipline. The French government banned the film for nearly 20 years. Generals called it an insult to the army. NATO allies were pressured not to screen it in Europe. Even some veterans groups in America rejected it, until they saw it for themselves. Then everything changed. Real soldiers recognized their own experiences, the blind arrogance of command, the futility of orders, the horror of dying for someone else's reputation. One veteran wrote to Kubrick, "You showed the truth we were never allowed to speak." Behind the scenes, Kubrick's perfectionism pushed everyone to the limit. Douglas later said, "He didn't want us to act heroes. He wanted us to act human." The result was raw, emotional devastation. When it finally resurfaced in France in the late 70s, old soldiers attended screenings and openly wept. It became the ultimate anti-war statement, not by condemning soldiers, but by showing how institutions sacrificed them. Decades later, Paths of Glory remains the film most veterans say got it painfully, perfectly right. It reminds us that the true enemy isn't always across the battlefield. It's often the system that sends you there. War cinema often paints courage in bright colors, but the veterans who lived it remember only the gray. These forgotten films dared to strip away myth and show the cost of survival. Which of these brutal masterpieces have you seen or never heard of until now? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more hidden history. Hollywood loves to sell us glory in uniform. The rousing speeches, the clean uniforms, the last-minute victories. But ask the men who lived it, and they'll tell you the truth. Most movies miss the mark. Some, though, stripped away the polish and showed the raw reality that veterans actually recognized. These forgotten war films hit nerves because they got closer to the mud, the cold, and the fear. Which ones made the cut this time? Let's dig in. A Walk in the Sun, 1945. It begins with silence, not spectacle. That's what set A Walk in the Sun apart when it was released at the end of World War II. Instead of triumphal music and fiery speeches, it quietly followed one platoon of American infantry slogging across the Italian countryside. No sweeping heroics. Just men, dusty and weary, trying to stay alive long enough to take a farmhouse held by the enemy. Director Lewis Milestone, who had already shaken audiences with All Quiet on the Western Front, refused to sugarcoat the battlefield. He focused on small talk between soldiers, the slow march through heat, and the constant undercurrent of fear. Veterans noticed immediately. This wasn't Hollywood fantasy. This was the daily grind they remembered, the banter, the waiting, the random outbursts of violence, and the endless uncertainty of whether they'd see another sunrise. The film even stripped back the soundtrack, letting the rumble of boots and distant gunfire carry the mood. It was unnerving for audiences in 1945, used to morale-boosting propaganda. Critics at the time were divided, some calling it too plain, but veterans nodded. For them, it rang true. A Walk in the Sun never became a household title like The Longest Day or Patton, but its quiet authenticity earned lifelong respect from those who wore the uniform. Sometimes war wasn't about medals or last stands. It was about making it through the next dusty mile. Decision Before Dawn, 1951. Imagine fighting for the side you once called the enemy. That's the unusual premise of Decision Before Dawn, one of the few war films to dive into the strange, uneasy world of espionage in the ruins of Germany. Released just 6 years after the conflict ended, it told the story of German prisoners of war recruited by the Americans to sneak back into their homeland as spies. The film had something most didn't: authenticity. Shot on location in the bombed-out cities of post-war Germany, it looked nothing like the Hollywood backlots audiences were used to. You could see the crumbled buildings, the hollow-eyed civilians, and the eerie silence of places where life had been ripped away. For veterans, especially intelligence officers and scouts, this hit close to home. It wasn't about heroic charges or big battles. It was about trust, suspicion, and missions where one bad choice meant no return. Richard Basehart and Oscar Werner carried the weight of the film with subdued performances, showing the nerves and moral compromises that defined real espionage. Veterans respected that the movie didn't glamorize spying. It made it look like what it really was: lonely, dangerous, and often thankless. Critics of the time applauded its realism, but general audiences didn't flock to it. Too heavy, too ambiguous. Yet, for those who had worked behind the lines, Decision Before Dawn felt like someone had finally told their story. Forgotten today by many, it remains one of the few films to portray the intelligence war with grit instead of glamour. Hell is for Heroes, 1962. Steve McQueen doesn't play a larger-than-life hero here. He plays a soldier scraping by. That was the power of Hell is for Heroes, a compact, low-budget war film that dropped audiences right into the monotony and misery of holding a forgotten patch of the front line in France. The plot sounds almost too simple. A handful of American soldiers ordered to defend a position with no reinforcements, no resources, and little hope. But that simplicity was exactly the point. Directed by Don Siegel, the film zeroed in on fatigue, paranoia, and the kind of small-scale action that defined most of the real war. Veterans loved it because it showed what many remembered: not dramatic charges, but digging in, staring into the dark woods, and waiting for something awful to happen. McQueen's performance was understated, his character a prickly loner who knew too well that survival often meant cutting through the illusions of glory. James Coburn and Bobby Darin rounded out the cast, but the real star was the tone. Weary, raw, and stripped of Hollywood shine. For audiences in 1962, it wasn't a blockbuster. Too grim, too quiet. But for soldiers, especially those who had lived through the grind of holding pointless lines, Hell is for Heroes struck a chord. This was the forgotten side of war, the nights that stretched forever, the bad rations, the thin lines of men waiting for a fight they didn't want. The bridges at Toko-Ri, 1954. Where do we get such men? That haunting final line from The Bridges at Toko-Ri still chills anyone who has seen it. Based on James Michener's novel, this Korean War film put the spotlight on naval aviators sent on what they knew were near-suicidal missions. Starring William Holden and Grace Kelly, the movie followed one pilot torn between his duty and his longing to get back home to his family. For veterans who flew over Korea, it was painfully accurate. The flight deck procedures, the cramped ready rooms, the long silences before launch, all of it mirrored their own experiences. The movie didn't offer Hollywood triumphs. Instead, it gave viewers a sobering reminder that not every mission ended with a victory lap. The dogfights were tense but not exaggerated. The carrier operations were handled with remarkable attention to detail, and the ending refused to comfort the audience with an easy win. When it came out in 1954, audiences weren't sure what to make of it. Some wanted more optimism, more cheer. Veterans, though, recognized the truth. They knew about missions that were all but impossible, where survival felt like a lottery. For them, The Bridges at Toko-Ri got it right. This film doesn't appear on many greatest war movie lists today, but for those who wore flight suits and braced against the icy winds of the Korean conflict, it remains one of the most honest portrayals Hollywood ever attempted. Merrill's Marauders, 1962. If you want to know what jungle warfare really felt like, look here. Merrill's Marauders told the story of a legendary American unit sent deep into Burma during World War II, fighting exhaustion and disease almost as much as the enemy. Directed by Samuel Fuller, himself a veteran who had fought in Europe, the film was praised by those who knew how grueling long campaigns could be. Jeff Chandler starred as General Merrill, leading his men on a mission that demanded endless marches through swamps, mountains, and disease-ridden terrain. Fuller, even when working within studio limits, infused the movie with details that veterans respected: the blisters, the sleepless nights, the muttered complaints of men who felt they had been forgotten by higher command. Unlike many war movies of the era, Merrill's Marauders didn't glorify its subjects. Instead, it showed them as bone-tired, underfed, and often pushed to the breaking point. Veterans who had slogged through jungles in the Pacific or Southeast Asia said it captured the misery all too well. The film didn't dominate the box office, but it left a mark on those who had lived similar hardships. In fact, military historians often point to Merrill's Marauders as one of the few films that even tried to portray jungle campaigns realistically. No glossy backdrops, no swelling scores to ease the blow, just mud, sweat, and the nagging question of how much more a man can take before he breaks. The Naked and the Dead, 1958, war strips men down to their bones, and this film, and showed it. The Naked and the Dead, adapted from Norman Mailer's searing novel, dared to pull the mask off World War II and reveal soldiers not as clean-cut heroes, but as flawed, frightened, and sometimes broken men. Set in the Pacific, it followed a group of American troops on a mission through the jungle, carrying not just rifles, but grudges, insecurities, and festering resentments. Director Raoul Walsh brought a hard edge to the film, and while the studio forced him to soften some of Mailer's grimmest themes, enough of the raw truth survived to make veterans nod in recognition. This wasn't about good versus evil. It was about how power warped commanders, how fear chewed at the rank and file, and how survival meant facing not just the enemy in front of you, but the demons inside your own unit. The soldiers bicker, doubt, and crack under pressure. Details veterans said mirrored their own memories of long campaigns. Critics at the time were split. Some felt it was too bleak. Others thought it lacked the flash of more popular war dramas. But veterans knew. They'd seen selfish leaders and cowardice in the ranks. They'd felt the jungle pressing in like a noose. For them, The Naked and the Dead captured the uncomfortable truth. War didn't just test courage, it exposed character. Today, it's mostly forgotten, overshadowed by bigger war epics. But for those who served, it still stands as one of the few films that dared to show the cracks in the myth of the perfect soldier. Sands of Iwo Jima, 1949. John Wayne as a symbol of grit, but not untouchable. Sands of Iwo Jima gave audiences one of Wayne's most iconic roles, yet it wasn't the swagger that stuck with veterans. It was the authenticity stitched into the fabric of the film, telling the story of a Marine sergeant training green recruits for the brutal campaign in the Pacific. The film leaned on real battle footage and input from veterans who had actually fought there. Marines respected the little things, the way weapons were carried, the nervous glances before battle, the exhausted slumps after long marches. Wayne's Sergeant Stryker wasn't painted as flawless. He was tough, abrasive, sometimes cruel, but undeniably human. For many veterans, that rang true. They had known leaders who barked, cursed, and demanded everything from their men, and who often paid the price themselves. The inclusion of the famous flag-raising scene on Mount Suribachi, recreated with the surviving Marines who had actually been there, gave the film a gravity that audiences couldn't miss. Critics hailed it as a stirring piece of patriotism, but veterans focused on the details that others overlooked: the sweat, the shouting, the tired eyes of men who knew the odds. Sands of Iwo Jima wasn't perfect, but it captured the spirit of endurance and sacrifice in a way few films dared. Veterans respected it for reminding the world that victory wasn't free, and that behind every famous photograph were men who had bled and broken to raise that flag. The Devil's Brigade, 1968. Forget polish. This was mud, sweat, and makeshift unity. The Devil's Brigade told the story of the 1st Special Service Force, a combined Canadian-American commando unit that fought in some of the harshest conditions of World War II. Think of it as the real Dirty Dozen, except the grit came from history, not Hollywood imagination. Starring William Holden, Cliff Robertson, and Vince Edwards, the film captured the rough beginnings of the unit: mismatched soldiers, clashing cultures, and training so brutal that only the toughest made it through. Veterans respected how the film leaned into the details: rope climbs, freezing camps, and endless drills that pushed men to the edge. This wasn't glamorous montage material. It was survival school with blisters and bruises. When the unit finally went into combat, the film didn't shy away from the chaos. Firefights were messy, orders confusing, and victories costly. For veterans, that rang true. They knew teamwork wasn't built overnight. It was forged in pain, frustration, and the grudging respect of men who learned to depend on each other. The Devil's Brigade wasn't a blockbuster. Released in the late 1960s, it was overshadowed by flashier war and action movies. But among veterans, it earned credibility. They knew the force was real, and they knew the kind of punishing grind the film portrayed. It's rarely talked about today, but for those who lived through commando training or combined operations, the Devil's Brigade felt like someone had finally put their sweat and sacrifice on the screen. Run Silent, Run Deep, 1970. 958. Claustrophobia, distrust, and the constant dread of the deep. Run Silent, Run Deep is one of the most respected submarine films ever made, and veterans of the Silent Service nodded at its accuracy. Starring Clark Gable as a relentless captain and Burt Lancaster as his skeptical executive officer, the story played out less like a standard war picture and more like a chess match under crushing pressure. The film captured the tight quarters of submarine life. Men crammed together, sweat dripping from the pipes, tension so thick you could cut it. The authenticity wasn't an accident. The filmmakers had Navy advisors, and the set design recreated submarine interiors down to the smallest detail. Veterans recognized the procedures, the discipline, and the terrifying wait during depth charge scenes. That waiting game, knowing danger was near but unseen, was exactly what submariners remembered. What also stood out was the conflict between Gable and Lancaster's characters, echoing the leadership struggles real crews sometimes faced. In the end, it wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about whether a captain's obsession would doom his men. Critics praised it as one of the most intelligent war films of its time, and veterans embraced it for showing the emotional and psychological strain of life below the surface. While most audiences today know Das Boot as the ultimate sub-movie, Run Silent, Run Deep deserves its place as the blueprint. Veterans said it got the tension, the dread, and the leadership dilemmas right. Beach Red, 1967, a war film that felt more like a fever dream. Beach Red, directed by Cornell Wilde, wasn't a big studio release, but it left veterans shaken by its strange mix of poetry and brutality. Set in the Pacific Theater, it told the story of Marines storming a beach and then enduring the long, draining push inland. Instead of focusing on sweeping battles, Wilde filled the film with flashes of memory, dreamlike narration, and stark images of death and survival. The effect was unsettling, and that was the point. Veterans who saw it in the late 1960 seconds recognized something that other movies often missed: the disorientation of combat, the blur between exhaustion and hallucination, the way time seemed to stretch or collapse in the middle of chaos. Beach Red was messy, fragmented, sometimes hard to watch, but so was the reality it was trying to capture. Critics were baffled. Some thought it was too experimental, others dismissed it as low-budget art house fare. But veterans who had fought in the Pacific said it came closer than most to showing what it felt like on the inside. Not the clear, rousing version of history, but the foggy, haunted one that stayed with them after the war ended. Forgotten today except by serious film buffs, Beach Red deserves rediscovery. It wasn't polished, it wasn't pretty, but it gave veterans something few films dared: the fractured, haunting reality of survival in a jungle that swallowed men whole. Attack on the Iron Coast, 1968. Commandos Against the Odds. That's the pulse of Attack on the Iron Coast, a modest British war film that slipped under the radar but earned respect from those who knew the difficulty of amphibious raids. Starring Lloyd Bridges, it dramatized a daring assault on Nazi-held docks in France. What veterans admired wasn't the scale. The film was made on a shoestring budget, but the attention to procedure. From the tense planning stages to the rehearsals and the inevitable unraveling of the mission once boots hit the ground, the story showed just how much could go wrong in these one-shot operations. Veterans nodded at the endless waiting, the sudden bursts of chaos, and the sense that victory often meant nothing more than surviving long enough to retreat. Critics at the time brushed it off as another mid-tier war adventure. But veterans saw something else: the authenticity of tight-knit units, the nerves in the hours before dawn, and the crushing reality that even the most carefully planned raids could turn into disaster zones. Attack on the Iron Coast isn't flashy, but it captured a truth few war films bother to show. Sometimes, bravery meant going into missions knowing the odds were stacked against you and going anyway. The Cruel Sea, 1953. The enemy wasn't just out there, it was the ocean itself. The Cruel Sea, adapted from Nicholas Monserrat's novel, remains one of the most powerful depictions of life aboard convoy escorts in the Atlantic. Starring Jack Hawkins, it stripped away the glamour of naval combat and replaced it with saltwater, exhaustion, and relentless anxiety. For veterans of the Royal Navy, this film was almost painful to watch. It nailed the constant battle against seasickness, fatigue, and the grinding stress of protecting merchant ships from unseen submarines. The most unforgettable moment comes when the captain must order depth charges dropped on a suspected submarine. Even though friendly sailors are in the water nearby, that moral weight crushed audiences, and veterans admitted it mirrored the kind of impossible decisions real officers faced. Critics called it bleak. Audiences found it grim, but sailors respected it for telling their truth. There were no glorious broadsides or swelling victory. Music. Just a reminder that for every dramatic clash at sea, there were months of misery, cold nights, and the endless watch for shadows in the waves. The Cruel Sea may not be widely remembered today, but for those who spent years in the Atlantic, it was the rare film that respected their ordeal. The Long Day's Dying, 1968, a war film with more silence than speeches. The Long Day's Dying wasn't made for mass audiences, and maybe that's why it feels so raw. This British production followed 3 paratroopers cut off behind enemy lines, wandering through a ruined landscape where trust is fragile and survival feels pointless. There are no big set pieces here, no patriotic crescendos. Instead, the camera lingers on exhaustion, paranoia, and the awkward conversations men have when they realize they might not make it back. Veterans recognize that rhythm, the long stretches of nothing, punctuated by sudden bursts of violence. What made it different was the way it focused on psychology. These soldiers weren't fearless. They argued, doubted orders, and sometimes froze when action came. For audiences used to square-jawed heroes, this was disconcerting. For veterans, it was familiar. They'd seen it, lived it, felt it. Critics at the time were harsh, calling it too slow or too bleak. But veterans gave it credit for capturing something most war movies ignored: the futility that often hung over missions where no one could even explain why they were there. The Long Day's Dying has been mostly forgotten, but for those who want to see a war film that strips away the romance and stares straight at despair, this one still packs a punch. Too Late the Hero, 1970. When orders mean nothing, survival is the only mission. Too Late the Hero, directed by Robert Aldrich, was a grim, cynical take on World War II that veterans recognized for its brutal honesty. Michael Caine and Cliff Robertson starred in this story of an Allied patrol sent on a near-hopeless mission through the Pacific jungle. The film broke away from tradition. Instead of glorifying the mission, it showed the fractures in leadership, the bitter rivalries, and the creeping realization among the men that their lives were being gambled away for little gain. Veterans who had lived through pointless operations, marching, sweating, losing friends, only to abandon the ground they fought for, felt the sting of recognition. Aldrich was no stranger to tough war films, and here he leaned into futility. The soldiers aren't larger than life. They're frightened, angry, and exhausted. When the mission begins to unravel, the audience isn't left with triumph, but with the same bitter taste the characters carry. Critics and audiences were divided. Some wanted heroics, others found it too bleak. Veterans, though, gave it quiet respect. They knew not every patrol had a happy ending, and sometimes the hardest truth to swallow was that the sacrifice had no payoff. Too Late the Hero may not be celebrated in the halls of war movie classics, but for those who served, it spoke with uncomfortable honesty. Fires on the Plain, 1965, not the Ichikawa masterpiece, but another gut punch all the same. While most film fans know the Japanese version of Fires on the Plain, few remember that a Filipino adaptation emerged later, carrying the same themes of despair and survival. Set during the dying days of the war in the Philippines, it told the story of soldiers abandoned without food, medicine, or hope. What made it resonate with veterans was its stark portrayal of starvation and illness, enemies as deadly as any uniform. Unlike Hollywood productions, this version leaned heavily on atmosphere. The jungle looked suffocating, the soldiers gaunt and stumbling. There were no clean uniforms, no triumphant marches, just the endless, degrading struggle to stay alive one more day. Veterans who had fought in the Pacific said it hit close to home. They remembered the hunger, the exhaustion, the endless fear that tomorrow might not come. Critics barely noticed it, overshadowed by Ichikawa's more famous film. But those who did see it respected its willingness to look straight at the ugliest part of war: abandonment, decay, and the silence of being forgotten. Fires on the Plain, in any version, isn't for the faint of heart, But for veterans, it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to tell the truth. War films usually sell us clean victories, but veterans know the real stories were mud-caked, weary, and often without glory. These forgotten gems may not have made millions at the box office, but they earned something far more important: respect from those who lived it. Which of these films surprised you most? And which one deserves a modern revival? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories the history books forgot to tell. Hollywood has made a fortune glamorizing war, but ask anyone who's actually been in combat and they'll tell you, most movies get it dead wrong. The grit, the fear, the mud that never washes out. It's usually scrubbed away for box office shine, but a handful of forgotten films cut closer to the bone, so real that veterans nodded in recognition. Which ones earned their respect? Stick around, because some of these titles will genuinely surprise you. The Hill, 1965. Forget the explosions, the tanks, and the patriotic music. Sidney Lumet's The Hill is a war movie where the battlefield is a British military prison in the blazing Sahara. Sean Connery, desperate to shed his James Bond tuxedo, plays a disgraced soldier locked in a nightmare of heat, stone walls, and punishment drills that break men down to the bone. The Hill isn't a metaphor. It's an actual man-made mound of sand and gravel the prisoners are forced to climb over and over until they collapse. What makes this film unforgettable is its raw psychological warfare. The enemy isn't Nazis or Japanese soldiers. It's your own commanding officers. The sadistic sergeant major, played with terrifying intensity by Harry Andrews, becomes the symbol of how institutions can chew men up long after the shooting stops. Veterans recognize the claustrophobic realism, the sweat-drenched exhaustion, the stripped dignity, the quiet defiance. It all rang true. The Hill didn't storm the box office, but it stormed reputations. Critics hailed it as one of Lumet's most fearless works. Connery himself called it one of his proudest performances, a role that let him prove he was more than a martini-swilling spy. The film is harsh, unflinching, and all too real. No wonder many soldiers said, "This one got it right." The Big Red One, 1980. When World War II veteran Samuel Fuller made The Big Red One, he wasn't telling Hollywood fairy tales. He was telling his own story. Fuller had fought with the 1st Infantry Division, the real Big Red One, from North Africa to Normandy. His memories of foxholes, mud, and men dying in silence shaped every gritty frame of this film. Lee Marvin leads the cast as a weary sergeant who's seen it all, guiding a squad of green soldiers through Europe's killing fields. Unlike glossy war epics, The Big Red One feels jagged, raw, and sometimes unfinished, and that's the point. War isn't neat. Fuller wanted the chaos to seep into the film itself, as if the audience had been dropped into a trench. Veterans who watched it recognized the authenticity immediately. The long marches, the empty eyes, the absurd mix of horror and boredom. This was the real deal. Fuller even said he wanted people to feel the war's smell, that unforgettable mix of sweat, cordite, and fear. The movie didn't rake in massive profits, partly because it was released in a decade drowning in big-budget blockbusters. But its legacy endures. Decades later, critics restored the film to Fuller's original vision, giving it the recognition it deserved. The Big Red One remains one of the truest depictions of soldiers slogging through World War II. Not heroes, not villains, just men trying to survive another day. The Steel Helmet, 1951. Hollywood barely blinked at the Korean War, but Samuel Fuller, again drawing from his own combat experience, made the Steel Helmet on a shoestring budget, and veterans swore it nailed the truth. Shot in 10 days with almost no money, the film follows a cynical American sergeant and a ragtag band of survivors trying to survive behind enemy lines. The helmets look dented, the uniforms filthy, and the faces lined with exhaustion. There's no glamour here, just paranoia, suspicion, and the nagging question of whether anyone will live to see sunrise. For audiences in 1951, this was a gut punch. The war was still raging. The film's unvarnished portrayal of mistrust, fear, and racial tension among the soldiers was far too close to reality. Fuller didn't just rely on imagination. He'd been a decorated veteran of World War II and poured his memories straight into the script. The soldiers weren't flawless heroes. They were messy, bitter, and sometimes broken. Veterans in the audience nodded. They'd seen those faces in their own units. The steel helmet sparked outrage from military brass, who hated its honesty. But audiences and critics recognized it as groundbreaking. Fuller made war look like what it was: dirty, confusing, and merciless. Veterans respected that he didn't flinch, and that's why this forgotten little film still carries weight decades later. Go Tell the Spartans, 1978. By the late 1970s, Hollywood had churned out plenty of flashy Vietnam War films. But Go Tell the Spartans wasn't flashy. It was stripped down and brutally real. Burt Lancaster, already in the twilight of his career, plays a weary officer stationed in Vietnam in 1964, just as America was slipping deeper into the quicksand. There are no sweeping battle scenes here, no victory parades, no epic scores swelling over a flag. Instead, there's mud, wasted lives, and orders that make no sense. Veterans who served early in the conflict praised the film for capturing the bitter absurdity of fighting for hills that would be abandoned days later. Director Ted Post avoided glamour and focused on futility. The film shows soldiers struggling not with courage but with bureaucracy, bad intel, and the crushing realization that they were pawns in a game already lost. Critics at the time shrugged it off, saying it was too bleak. But veterans knew better. This was how it felt: lonely, senseless, and draining. Though it never made big money, Go Tell the Spartans has since been embraced as one of the most accurate Vietnam films ever made. It's the kind of movie where veterans leaned back, sighed, and said, "Yeah, that's exactly how it was." The Hill in Korea, 1956. If America largely ignored the Korean War, Britain gave it one rare film: The Hill in Korea. Released in 1956, it was the first feature about the conflict made in the UK, and it quietly captured the exhaustion of soldiers stuck in a war the world wanted to forget. The plot follows a British patrol cut off and surrounded, forced to fight against staggering odds. What made the film stand out wasn't the gunfire or the trenches, it was the faces. Many extras were actual veterans, men who had been there just a few years earlier, and their weary authenticity bleeds through the screen. The filmmakers didn't sugarcoat the mud, fear, and frustration. Instead of endless heroics, we see soldiers stumbling through exhaustion, clinging to discipline even when hope fades. For British audiences, it was a sobering reminder of a war that had claimed thousands of their own, but was already slipping into obscurity. The Hill in Korea never became a global hit, but veterans respected it as one of the only films that treated their sacrifices with honesty. It remains a haunting testament to what it felt like to fight in a war almost forgotten before it even ended. Battleground, 1949. Most World War II movies of the 1940s were morale boosters. But Battleground? It was mud-caked, bone-chilling reality. Directed by William Wellman, himself a World War I veteran, the film followed a group of American paratroopers trapped in the siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Forget glossy propaganda, this one was all frostbite, foxholes, and desperation. The soldiers don't look like posters for recruitment. They look like men who haven't slept in days, wrapped in blankets, gnawing on frozen food, cursing the weather as much as the enemy. Veterans who fought in Europe saw themselves on screen for the first time. Their reality wasn't about constant heroics. It was about surviving cold nights, wondering if reinforcements would ever come. The production had military advisors who had actually been there. MGM originally thought the film was too bleak, but test audiences and veterans disagreed. They embraced it for its honesty. Even General Omar Bradley, who commanded at Bastogne, praised it for getting the details right. Battleground ended up a critical and commercial success, but strangely, it faded behind louder, flashier WW2 films. Veterans, though, never forgot it. They respected that this movie captured the simple, awful truth. Sometimes the toughest enemy wasn't bullets. It was the cold and the weight. Men in War. 1957. Anthony Mann's Men in War didn't bother with patriotic speeches. It's a Korean War film that plays like a pressure cooker, where every second on screen crackles with tension. Robert Ryan plays a weary lieutenant trying to keep his depleted platoon alive. Aldo Ray storms in as a tough-as-nails sergeant who doesn't care about rules, only survival. The plot? Simple. Get across enemy territory before time runs out. But what unfolds is a brutal study in leadership, fatigue, and the crushing weight of command. Veterans respected its honesty. The soldiers aren't clean-shaven heroes, they're dirty, ragged, and exhausted. The war isn't noble, it's endless. What really sold the authenticity was the focus on small details. The long silences, the constant scanning of ridgelines, the nagging sense that death could come at any second. Man didn't aim for spectacle. He aimed for psychological realism, and veterans recognized it immediately. The movie wasn't a box office juggernaut. Audiences looking for thrills were put off by its bleakness. But among those who served, Men in War became a quiet classic. It's still remembered as one of the most painfully accurate depictions of what it felt like to slog through Korea's forgotten battlefields. Destination Tokyo, 1943. Starring Cary Grant, this World War II submarine drama was made during the war itself, but instead of propaganda gloss, it gave audiences a surprisingly detailed, authentic look at submarine life. The film follows an American sub on a dangerous mission into Japanese waters, where the crew faces everything from depth charges to claustrophobic isolation. Veterans of the Silent Service respected the movie for its technical accuracy. Submarine interiors were recreated in painstaking detail, right down to the crammed bunks, sweating pipes, and suffocating lack of privacy. The film avoided painting the men as invincible heroes. Instead, it showed them as ordinary sailors under extraordinary pressure, struggling with fear, fatigue, and impossible odds. What really stood out for veterans was how well the film captured the day-to-day grind of submarine duty. Long hours of silence, the constant threat of detection, the nerve-shattering tension of waiting for depth charges to explode. This was life under the waves. Cary Grant, usually known for charm and wit, gave one of his most grounded performances, portraying a captain balancing authority with compassion. While it served as wartime inspiration for home audiences, Destination Tokyo never slipped into fantasy. Veterans later remarked that, for a film made in the heat of war, it got the mood right. It reminded them not of speeches and parades, but of the claustrophobic struggle of life below the surface. Today it's remembered as one of the most authentic submarine films of its era, praised for respecting the experiences of the men who actually lived it. Pork Chop Hill, 1959. If one film captured the sheer futility of the Korean War, it was Pork Chop Hill. Gregory Peck stars as an officer leading troops to seize a hill that even the commanders admit has no real value. The soldiers bleed, sweat, and die for a patch of dirt destined to be abandoned. This wasn't Hollywood patriotism, it was tragedy. Veterans who fought in Korea saw the pointlessness they had lived through reflected in every frame. The film showed young soldiers grappling with exhaustion, terror, and the realization that victory could mean nothing. Director Louis Milestone, who had made All Quiet on the Western Front decades earlier, knew how to strip away false heroics. His style leaned on grit, mud, and men slumped against sandbags with hollow eyes. Critics praised Gregory Peck's leadership performance, but veterans praised the details, the confusion of night attacks, the frantic radio calls, the endless waiting between bursts of violence. Pork Chop Hill wasn't a runaway commercial success, but for those who'd fought in Korea, it mattered. They said it showed the one truth most war movies avoided. Sometimes you fight, you lose friends, and the world barely notices. Fixed Bayonets, 1951. Before Fuller made The Big Red One, he gave audiences another brutally honest war film, Fixed Bayonets. Set during the Korean War, it follows an inexperienced corporal suddenly thrust into command when his superiors are picked off one by one. This wasn't about gallantry. It was about responsibility crushing down on a man who never wanted it. Veterans praised the film for capturing the terrifying reality of leadership in combat, the weight of making life or death calls for men who look to you for answers, even when you're just as scared. Fuller's fingerprints are all over it. The man knew combat. He had lived it. His screenplay emphasizes exhaustion, fear, and the randomness of survival. The soldiers aren't invincible. They're cold, frightened, and desperate to make it through. Fixed Bayonets was praised for its realism and even used by military schools as a teaching tool, but mainstream audiences overlooked it, preferring more polished war films of the era. Veterans, though, latched onto its truth. The movie said out loud what they'd all felt. Being a hero often meant nothing more than doing your job while scared out of your mind. Attack, 1956. What happens when the officer in charge is the real enemy? That's the central fire burning through Attack, a World War II drama directed by Robert Aldrich. Jack Palance plays a lieutenant who's brave and battle-hardened, while Eddie Albert plays a cowardly captain who repeatedly puts his men at risk to save his own skin. This wasn't a film about noble sacrifice. It was about betrayal from within. Veterans responded to that with a knowing shake of the head because they'd seen it. Leaders who froze in combat. Commanders who hid while others bled. Aldrich didn't shy away from showing the chaos and rage this sparked among the ranks. The Army hated it, fearing it undermined the image of military leadership. But veterans said it rang truer than the polished portraits and recruitment ads. The movie's final act, a furious confrontation between Palance and Albert under fire, still hits like a grenade. It was less about battlefield glory and more about the terrifying consequences of cowardice at the top. Attack didn't get the box office love of bigger war epics, but it earned something far more important. Credibility with the men who knew what it felt like to be let down by someone wearing bars on their shoulders. Fires on the Plain, 1959. If most war films are about glory, Fires on the Plain is about what happens when all of that is stripped away and nothing remains but hunger and despair. Directed by Kon Ichikawa, this Japanese masterpiece doesn't glorify combat. It shows the brutal, soul-crushing reality of soldiers abandoned to die in the Philippines during the final days of World War II. The story follows a tubercular soldier, Private Tamura, turned out by his own unit because he's too sick to fight and too much of a burden to feed. Wandering through a landscape littered with corpses and starving survivors, Tamura encounters comrades who have been reduced to shadows of themselves. The jungle isn't just a backdrop, it's a graveyard. Bullets are scarce, food scarcer, and hope nearly extinct. Veterans respected the film's honesty. They knew that war wasn't always about climactic battles. More often, it was about survival in mud, about watching men wither away, about the quiet horror of realizing the enemy wasn't just across the line, it was disease, starvation, and hopelessness. Fires on the Plain captured that in a way few films ever dared. At the time of its release, the movie shocked audiences in Japan. It was criticized for being too bleak, too harsh, too unpatriotic. But that rawness is what made it resonate with soldiers. No propaganda, no speeches, no victories, just the truth of what happens when armies collapse and men are left behind. Fires on the Plain has since been restored and praised as one of the most important anti-war films ever made. For veterans, it was the rare movie that didn't try to make their sacrifices pretty. It showed what war really costs when everything else is gone. The Young Lions, 1958. Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and Dean Martin, three powerhouse actors. One bold war film that dared to show humanity on both sides of World War, The Young Lions. Adapted from Irwin Shaw's novel, followed three men. A German soldier disillusioned by the Nazi cause, a Jewish private fighting prejudice within his own army, and a playboy drafted into combat. Unlike typical war dramas of its era, The Young Lions avoided simple good versus evil tropes. Brando's German officer wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a man struggling with conscience and duty. Montgomery Clift's Jewish soldier fought battles inside his own unit, as anti-Semitism simmered alongside the larger war. Dean Martin's character, initially reluctant, grew into his role as a soldier. Veterans appreciated the nuance. They knew war wasn't black and white. It was contradictions, doubts, and men who carried baggage into battle. The film's refusal to paint anyone as flawless heroes or faceless monsters felt closer to the complexity they remembered. It was long, sometimes uneven, and critics debated its politics. But The Young Lion stood out as one of the first mainstream films to say out loud, "War is fought by individuals, each with their own fears, flaws, and humanity." And that's why veterans said it got the essence right. The Men, 1950. Before Brando electrified Hollywood with A Streetcar Named Desire, he made his film debut in The Men, a quiet, devastating story about veterans coming home broken. Directed by Fred Zinnemann, it focused on soldiers paralyzed in combat, confined to wheelchairs, and struggling to find their place in a world that had moved on without them. This wasn't the triumphant return parades promised. This was reality. Marriages under strain, bitterness simmering, and hope running thin. Brando lived in a veterans hospital for a month to prepare, learning how to maneuver a wheelchair and immersing himself in the daily lives of real paraplegic vets. Many of them appear in the film as extras. The result was so authentic that veterans both praised and criticized it. Some said it finally showed their truth. Others said it was too harsh, too raw, too depressing. But nearly all agreed it wasn't Hollywood fantasy. It was the closest thing to what they felt waking up in hospitals with futures they didn't recognize. The Men wasn't a huge hit, but for those who served, it mattered. It told them that at least once Hollywood remembered that war didn't end when the shooting stopped. It ended in quiet hospital rooms, with lives forever changed. They were expendable. 1945, directed by John Ford and starring John Wayne and Robert Montgomery, They Were Expendable might sound like a typical flag-waving Woody film, but dig deeper, and you'll find one of the most brutally honest depictions of loss and sacrifice Hollywood dared to release during wartime. The story follows PT boat crews in the Philippines as they fight against overwhelming Japanese forces after Pearl Harbor. The title alone tells you the message. These men weren't heroes destined for glory. They were pawns sent to hold the line, knowing their odds of survival were slim. What made it resonate with veterans was Ford's refusal to sugarcoat. The combat sequences are tense but not triumphant. The mood is somber, haunted by the knowledge that victory is out of reach. Robert Montgomery, himself a former Navy officer who commanded PT boats, brought first-hand experience to the role, adding credibility veterans immediately spotted. Released while the war was still raging, the film was both a tribute and a warning. The Navy cooperated with production, but veterans knew the truth in its title. Sometimes soldiers were sent into battles they couldn't win, and their sacrifices barely made the headlines. For veterans, They Were Expendable wasn't just a movie. It was an echo of reality, a reminder that some stories were told, not to inspire, but to honor. War films usually sell us tidy victories and clean uniforms. But these 15 forgotten gems, they showed the dirt under the fingernails, the fear in the foxholes, and the leadership that sometimes failed. That's why veterans swore they got it right. Which of these films surprised you most, and which do you think deserves a modern revival? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe, and keep the conversation alive.